Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, and welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and vaccines. And I'm Whitney. I'm with the Canadian Immunodeficiencies Patient Organization, and I'm not going to be speaking tonight. That's not who you came to hear. I just want to give a few brief reminders. This webinar is being recorded, so please stay on mute so that we can hear these wonderful speakers and experts. And for privacy's sake, please keep your video off and use the chat function. If you have any technical issues, there are a couple members of the CIPO staff here to help. So you can direct message the CIPO office or Aaron Harder, and we will help you out. And there are already a couple of chats there, so we will get to you as soon as we can. In the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Dr. Stephen Betschel, who is going to be the moderator for this session. Stephen.
Terrific. Thank you, Whitney. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Terrific. Okay. Whitney, thank you once again for putting together a session like this. When I think back, I think the first Zoom webinar that we had was back in June or so, when we were just starting to grapple with the issue of COVID and immune deficiency overall. And it really is quite surprising. I know we've had some hiccups with vaccines along the way, but it really is amazing that within 8 months, we're having now a webinar about vaccine and COVID. So it really is a pleasure to chair this. I'm Steve Betschel. I'm a clinical immunologist and allergist at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And tonight we have 2 speakers who are going to present, and we've got you covered from east to west. I'll start with the west because Dr. Hildebrand is going to go first, then I'll introduce Dr. Lacuesta, who's going to go afterwards. So Dr. Kyla Hildebrand is a pediatric clinical immunologist and allergist at the University of British Columbia. She serves as a program director at the University of British Columbia for the Pediatric Clinical Immunology and Allergy program. And she also has another hat, which is very relevant to tonight. And she is a voting member on the National Advisory Committee of Immunizations, NACI. She will go first, followed by Dr. Lacuesta. Dr. Gina Lacuesta is an adult clinical immunology and allergist in Halifax, who is actively involved in treating patients and advocating for patients with primary immunodeficiencies. What I'd like to also share is that both Dr. Hildebrand and Dr. Lacuesta are recent additions to the Medical Advisory Committee or medical directors at CIPO. So on that note, what I'll do is I'll just introduce one more thing. So after the 2 presentations, we're going to go through some question and answers that have been submitted beforehand, and we hope to get to most of them depending on the time. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hildebrand, to lead the presentations.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Betschel. Really happy to be here today. I'm just trying to get my screen share going, and just give me 1 minute and I will work through that. Perfect. It should be coming up here in just a second. There we go. Okay, so you should see my slides pulled up here. So again, I'm Kyla Hildebrand. It's a pleasure to be here today. You know, I have to say it's so nice to, when I came into this meeting a bit early, to see all of the hand waves and the excited faces and smiles that came up when you saw perhaps others on this webinar that you are familiar with and friends with. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. It's my practice to begin presentations by giving a land acknowledgement and to tell you that I'm physically on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I feel really honored to be able to live, work, and raise my family here. And this picture is from White Lake, which is on Cypress Mountain, that I took with my family last weekend. All right, this is my only disclosure to tell you about. And then just to share 2 little learning objectives I thought for today, which is really to understand how vaccines work to create immunity and to identify that there are a number of different types of COVID-19 vaccines. So let's start first with how vaccines work. You know, when the immune system sees a pathogen, whether that's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus, you know, we have antibodies generally created because we've seen them before. The antigen on the surface of these pathogens look different, and that's what makes each one so unique. When there isn't a pre-existing exposure to a pathogen such as COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we have no antibody in place, it's up to the immune system to figure it out and to go into defense mode and create these antibodies. What we do with immunizations is really to take a tiny piece of the pathogen. So for a virus, it might be part of the protein or something on the surface that our host immune systems can recognize in order to mount an immune response. And we do this by creating new antibodies to these surface molecules or components of the virus or the pathogen so that we can defeat it once we see it in real life. And it's not lost on me, this audience that I'm speaking with today in this webinar, that you know, we talk about vaccines as protecting a certain individual, but many of you here rely on the herd immunity of everyone else getting their immunizations in order to protect you or your loved ones who may not be able to get all vaccines. One of the key components to creating a vaccine is the antigen. And as I mentioned, this is something that's usually on the surface of the pathogen, that's something really small that isn't harmful in and of itself, but that your body can learn how to recognize at a future date so that you can recognize it without, in fact, getting sick. And as many of you likely know, if you've read a product monograph or an ingredient list for some of the vaccines or seen them circulating in the news media, you know, vaccines have a few things in them. So the first is the antigen, and this is what we've talked a little bit about already, but there's a few other things in there. And the one to point out is the adjuvant. So these are parts of a vaccine that get added in order to make the immune system respond more strongly than it would have otherwise. And the reason this is important is because it allows for the development of those long-lasting antibodies that we want to have stick around long after we've had the vaccine. A few other things that are in there as well include usually preservatives. Although that being said, some of the COVID-19 vaccines, such as the mRNA vaccines currently approved in Canada, do not have preservatives in them. There are also some stabilizers, surfactants, some residual materials, and then we need something to put it in so that we can actually give it to patients in a way that's an injection, for example, or perhaps a nasal spray. The response to vaccines is really important, and there's sort of two arms of this response. You'll hear a lot of discussion about these antibody responses as a result of getting vaccines, and we know, of course, these are really important, particularly to create sort of those immediate or those neutralizing antibodies that are often referred to in some of the articles you might read about COVID-19 vaccines. But one of the other important responses that doesn't get as much airtime in the media are these cell-mediated responses. And these are predominantly, mitigated by the T lymphocytes. And this, I think, is important, and perhaps Dr. Lacuesta will speak to this as well. Sometimes there are T cell functions that remain, and this is one of the benefits that we can achieve from receiving vaccines, even if we don't make such a great B cell response. All right, let's go through the different types of COVID-19 vaccines. This is a website that is hosted by the World Health Organization, and every week they update their data to show how many vaccines are currently under study for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. As you can see, there's over 250 presently. And what's really impressive is that 73 of them are in the clinical trial phase. Something that I get asked a lot about by patients, by my family members, is how did we get a vaccine so quickly? We've never seen that before. So I wanted to just back up and tell you a little bit about how vaccines are traditionally developed and the timeline that it takes. So probably the most time-intensive part of making a vaccine has to do with this discovery phase. This is where vaccines get designed. We explore them within different models of cells and animal models. And this discovery phase takes often several years. Once the discovery phase is completed, there's an investigational new drug application that gets filed. And only once that's happened can a phase 1 clinical trial begin. This is followed by phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, as long as everything went well along the way. What's really interesting is that these biologics license applications that need to get filed in order for a vaccine to be even reviewed by a regulatory agency like Health Canada, these happen usually only after the phase 3 trials are completed. Once the material is reviewed by the regulatory authority and they give the approval, most companies at that point will take the approval, they'll go to production, and then they start mass producing the vaccines. So what's different then about these COVID-19 vaccines? Well, a few things. In the case of the SARS-CoV-2 development, this discovery phase was completely omitted because we already had a lot of data about how to make a vaccine like this. And part of that is because of the SARS coronavirus that we saw several years ago, but also with the Middle Eastern respiratory virus as well. These are both versions of coronavirus. So the existing processes were just adopted and the clinical trials started. And as the interim results sort of came through with the phase 1 studies, they were already starting the phase 2 and phase 3. So you see that there's a bit of overlap here, and it doesn't happen in total sequence. The other difference is that our governments purchased these vaccines before they even saw the data about whether they would work or not. And this is what makes it so exceptional and unprecedented times, as we are hearing again and again, because of the urgency to get a vaccine to market and into Canadians. So you can see the time to production was 10 months to up to 1.5 years. So it's really incredible. In terms of making a vaccine, there's really 3 main approaches. So one is you can use the whole virus or the bacterium. Some examples of this include influenza vaccine or live attenuated vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella, varicella. The other way is that you can take parts of that trigger for the immune system. So not the whole virus or bacterium, but just a little piece of it. And oftentimes this is sort of something on the surface of the microbe. So it could be a little sugar chain that's sticking off, or maybe a protein residue, and that's recognized by the immune system. These types of vaccines use a virus as a vector that we know is safe in humans. And lastly, the third way is you could just deliver the genetic material to the person, to the host, and have the immune system figure out what it needs to code for in order to make those antibodies and develop them. And this is sort of the essence of the COVID-19, the mRNA and the DNA vaccines do this. So here are all the platforms that currently exist for SARS-CoV-2. And I'm going to walk you through kind of like how they work, how they're a little bit different from each other, and give you some of the advantages and disadvantages for each of them. And I'm leaving the best for last, which is the RNA vaccines, which many of you will be familiar with. Okay, so let's start here with this pictogram of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You can see that it has the virion inside, that sort of squiggly red thing in the middle. It has like this fatty membrane that goes around it, which is that yellow circle. And then it has these matrix proteins kind of embedded within that protein, within the lipid membrane. And those orange little spikes are what are known as the coronavirus spike protein. And the receptor binding domain is this one little area on the spike protein that has been targeted by most of the vaccine manufacturers to develop their vaccines with. So how this works is that the coronavirus, the spike protein, what will happen is that it's this genetic material that we're going to deliver into the host cell, and it binds to the receptor on our host cells, and then it's brought into the cell. Following that, we get fusion, or kind of like merging, or kind of they come together, and the contents of this get released into our own cells to be recognized by our immune systems. That's when antibodies that will bind the spike protein get made and can help neutralize the virus. So let's go through a few of the different platforms. The first is these inactivated vaccines that have the SARS-CoV-2. These ones are grown in cell cultures, and then we inactivate them with chemicals so that they aren't actually able to make us sick. What's beneficial about this one is that the entire virus is presented to the immune system, which means that our response isn't just going to be against that one spike protein, but it's to everything in that coronavirus that was presented to us. There are some vaccines like this in development in China, India, and Kazakhstan. The second category of are the live attenuated viruses, and these are weakened versions of the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 virus. And these are weakened to replicate to some extent, but not enough to make the immune system respond to the same degree as if it would have seen the natural infection. So how do we weaken these viruses? Well, we make them adapt to really not good environments to grow in. So we make them grow at lower temperatures or in non-human cells. We can also modify the virus by deleting certain genes that could counteract our immune system's ability to recognize them. One of the advantages is that this can be given intranasally. And an example of this is the influenza vaccine, where there's an option, you can get it injected in your arm, but there's also no spray versions of it. But again, these are live vaccines. The third category is recombinant protein vaccines. So this is where that binding domain that's really important that the vaccines have targeted as being the thing they're presenting. They kind of take pieces of it and express them in different types of systems like plants or yeast cells or insects. And the advantages are here that you can make this vaccine without actually handling the virus itself, which is really important when you think about resource poor settings or countries that don't have a lot of money to have big, high quality labs for safety to be able to handle these viruses. And some examples here are the Novavax or the Medicago vaccines. And I mentioned these because they are, the Medicago for certain is a Canadian-based company in Quebec. Next, we have another big category of vaccines, which are the viral vector vaccines. And the majority of these are based from an adenovirus, which is a type of virus we commonly see. We have lots of advantages here in that we know how to make these vaccines because we use them for Ebola vaccines, which are currently in development. And some examples of this are the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is sort of coming up the pipeline for approval in Canada, as well as some of the Chadox vaccines, such as the CanSino vaccine. DNA vaccines are another category. The advantages here are that you get a little plasmid of DNA that encodes for the spike protein. We deliver it into the host cells. We can make this at a really large scale, so it's easy to make this type of vaccine. And the plasmid is actually quite stable. The only problem is that it doesn't stimulate the immune system as strongly as we would like and what we see with other types of vaccine platforms. And then lastly, we come to the well-known RNA or mRNA vaccines. So this is where you get a little piece of RNA, which is sort of like the coding material that will make the proteins that we're delivering into the host. They're packaged in this kind of nanoparticle of fatty cells to kind of protect it. We're giving it into the body, and then we're helping to process it and learn to make it in our own system so that we can make our own antibodies towards it. We have pre-existing technology through the Zika virus and cytomegalovirus trials, but some of the disadvantages are that scaling it quickly and fast has been, we've noticed, a problem. And the storage is also a big issue in terms of the temperatures. It's very fragile and they need very low temperature refrigerators to store it. And the examples here are the Pfizer BioNTech as well as the Moderna vaccines. So just to give you a little bit of situational awareness about the COVID-19 vaccines in Canada, here's a table that demonstrates the advanced purchase agreements that Canada has made with the vaccine manufacturers. And you can see here, we have enough doses to immunize every single Canadian should they choose to get the vaccine. The ones bolded at top are currently approved, and the others are expected to present for review in the very near future. A lot of these are still in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, such as Medicago, the Novavax, as well as the Janssen. So really briefly, I'm going to leave you just with some numbers about the efficacy and safety of the Health Canada approved vaccines, and then 2 others that are coming up the pipeline for what we know so far. So the BioNTech vaccine is actually it's an excellent vaccine. It's been approved for use in Canada, was the very first approved vaccine, and we can use it in individuals who are 16 years and older. It's given in 2 doses, recommended 21 days apart, but it does require that ultra cold refrigeration. But it does have an efficacy of 95%. What's really interesting is this week, I was excited to bring this to you today, but there was a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine by 2 of my Canadian colleagues who looked again at the data from the Pfizer BioNTech looking at efficacy. And what they found was, if you look at the antibody, the degree in which they were able to prevent new infections, starting 14 days after the dose to just before the second dose was given, they found that there was a 92.6 efficacy, which essentially is kind of the same as like if they only had 1 dose, how effective would it be? And it turns out it's very high and almost similar to what a 2-dose regimen would be. The Moderna vaccine, again, approved for use in Canada for 18 years and older, efficacy really high, 94.1%. This one needs cold temperatures, but not quite as bad as the Pfizer. So this one I think is -2 to -8 degrees. This is widely used in Canada right now. And then just lastly, the 2 that are kind of coming up the pipeline are the Janssen or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So this is a carrier vaccine, which is a different approach than the mRNA. And it uses the adenovirus as well as a bit of a vector to get it into the body. And this one, what's interesting is that it's only 1 dose that's needed, and it has demonstrated a 72% overall efficacy. And then lastly, the ChAdOx or the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is currently approved and in use in the United Kingdom. It's an adenoviral vector vaccine. This one's benefit is that it has normal fridge temperatures for storage for up to 6 months, so much more user-friendly if you're looking at, places that are a bit more remote. It's recommended 2 doses and has an efficacy of 62%. So just to leave you here before I hand over to Dr. Lacuesta is that my take-home points here are that none of the vaccines for COVID-19 are currently approved in Canada are considered live vaccines. So no live vaccines. There are many different types of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, and the currently approved ones have really high efficacy of 92 to 95%. So on that note, I'll hand it over to you.
Sorry.
Terrific.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Kyla. And it really is, as you pointed out, a rapidly evolving field. And it really is important to understand the background of the vaccines. And thank you taking us through that. So we're going to move from the University of British Columbia over to Dalhousie with Dr. Lacuesta, and really, I think, move into, if we haven't already answered some of the questions that have been submitted, I think we'll continue to answer questions with the next presentation. So if we go a little bit over time and eat into the question and answer, I think we're probably getting through those now. So Dr. Lacuesta will take us through COVID vaccines and how they would be related to and what the recommendations would be for patients with primary immune deficiency. Dr. Lacuesta.
Thanks, Stephen. And thanks, Kyla, for the excellent background talk. I think it really leads nicely into my presentation, and we've now learned the background science of the vaccines, and we can talk about the practicalities. Oops, okay, there. So these are my disclosures. I really feel over the past month or so, ever since Christmas, vaccine work has become my second job. I feel like I'm eating, sleeping, breathing vaccine work now. I'm working with the provincial vaccine group, and I just took the position as the adult allergist consultant with the NACI vaccine safety working group. And as well, I've done some research and had consultant fees from the industry that makes the blood products for immunodeficiency. So I'm going to show you this very briefly. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I will point out it was just published in February of this year in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. So it's a worldwide study where they looked, they canvassed immunology treaters from North America, Europe, Australia, Latin America, to say, do you have patients who've had coronavirus infection, and how do we describe them? So just briefly from the abstract, this is data from very early in the pandemic, between March and June of 2020. 94 patients were identified as having COVID infections. 32 were under the age of 18, 62 were adults, and most of them were young adults, 25 to age 34. At least half of them had antibody deficiencies, which we know is the more common immunodeficiency to occur. And of course, the other 44% had other complicated immunodeficiencies. 10 had no symptoms whatsoever, 25 treated as outpatients, 28 were admitted to non-ICU wards, 13 patients were admitted and needed supplemental oxygen or non-invasive ventilation. Unfortunately, 18 did have to go to ICU, 12 were intubated, 9 patients did pass away, 7 adults and 2 children. So interestingly, the conclusions, around 30% had mild disease. They identified the usual risk factors that we would see in the general population. So underlying heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes. But definitely it was represented that younger patients with inborn errors of immunity, which is the new terminology we use for immunodeficiency patients, younger patients with immunodeficiency were more severely affected and admitted to the ICU compared to the general population. So this is why we're doing this work. I want to try and answer these three vaccine questions that you probably have for yourself. So number 1, should I get the COVID vaccine? Number 2, what can I expect when I get the COVID vaccine? And number 3, when will I get the COVID vaccine? So there's a lot of statements that get put out there that make it very confusing. So you may hear immunodeficiency patients weren't studied or included in the trials for the COVID vaccine. Some vaccines are dangerous in immunodeficiency patients. Vaccines don't work in immunodeficiency patients. You can't have the COVID vaccine if you have autoimmune disease. And of course, some patients with immunodeficiency will have autoimmunity as well. And also you can't have the COVID vaccine if you're on IVIG or subcutaneous immunoglobulin. So let's try and answer that. So why were immunodeficiency patients left out of the COVID vaccine trials? We know that response to any vaccine is variable in patients with a compromised immune system. We're not exactly sure they're going to mount the response compared to somebody who has a normal immune system. I'm sure many of you have already demonstrated that you don't respond to the typical vaccines. In order for them to do the studies that would not be affected or clouded by the individual's own immune system, and to know exactly what the true vaccine efficacy is, they had to exclude immunocompromised patients. You should know that safety of the vaccine is not likely to be increased concern in immunodeficiency patients over that of the general population. So what is the national statement for recommendations for immunization in immunocompromised patients? And again, this comes from NACI. So a complete COVID-19 vaccine series may be offered to individuals who are immunosuppressed if a risk assessment deems that the benefits outweigh the risks for an individual, and if informed consent includes discussion about this, that there is absence of evidence on this population. And this is a discretionary recommendation, meaning this is the best that we can say at this point. There's not a whole lot of evidence for making this statement. And of course, some patients may choose to wait for further evidence, but at this point, we do feel we can recommend it. The Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology statement also states that we should be offering our immunocompromised patients if the benefit outweighs the risk. Again, The European Society says something very similar. COVID vaccines are recommended provided they are not live vaccines. So certainly elsewhere in the world, they may be having exposure to live vaccines before we are here in Canada. And so you hear that argument of benefits versus risks. And so let's talk about what are the benefits of vaccination. So while there's limited data showing that immunodeficiency is a risk for severe COVID-19 infection, we don't really have lots of data and many patients who've experienced this. We do know it's common sense that immunodeficiency is going to be a risk factor for severe infections in general. So there likely will be some increased protection for you when you get the vaccine. Not all immunodeficiency patients have difficulty responding to vaccines, and even those with difficulty producing antibodies to those vaccines, there's still other mechanisms induced by the vaccine, as Kyla was talking about. There's that T-cell mediated response. So just because you haven't made antibodies traditionally before, I don't want you to think that you will have zero response to the vaccines. And of course, with vaccination, we protect ourselves, the vulnerable around us, and the societal benefits towards herd immunity. What are the risks of vaccination? So there's no safety signals for immunodeficiency patients that really has been identified. And there definitely has been immunodeficiency patients worldwide that have had their vaccines. Even though you may only have a partial response to the vaccine, it's better than having no vaccine response at all. And of course, we need to consider the side effects, and we'll talk about that a little later. What about autoimmunity? So again, it's a similar statement. We do think that the vaccine series may be offered to individuals with autoimmune conditions if the risk assessment deems that the benefits outweigh the risks, and that informed consent includes discussion about insufficient evidence at this time. The Rheumatology Association states something similar, as well as EULAR, which is the European League of autoimmune and rheumatological diseases. So they suggest giving COVID-19 vaccinations in patients with autoimmunity. For the majority of patients, the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms. Some patients at low risk for symptomatic COVID-19 or severe COVID-19 infection, such as the young, the healthy, perhaps those who have low numbers in their area, they may choose to wait for more information, which is a fine decision to make as well. They do make the point of those who may be on rituximab, which is a biologic, which really does shut down the antibody response. Their advice, as we've seen data from other vaccines, is to defer the vaccine more than 5 months from the last dose, and perhaps delay your dose of the rituximab at least 4 weeks after you get your COVID vaccine series. So again, what are the benefits in autoimmune conditions? While there's limited data looking at this, autoimmunity itself shouldn't affect the protective response to the vaccine. It's hard to know if autoimmunity is actually a risk for severe COVID infection. But again, we know vaccines will increase that protection. COVID infection itself could flare the autoimmune disease. And again, vaccines protect against that. And again, I'll make the statement, we protect ourselves and the vulnerable around us and progress towards herd immunity with vaccination. So the risks of vaccination in autoimmune patients is that there's a theoretical risk that the autoimmune disease may flare. But as I said previously, it may flare from the COVID infection itself. So depending on which autoimmune disease, the severity, how stable that autoimmune condition is, will make us make the decision as we move forward. The majority of patients with autoimmune conditions really should move forward. But if you have poorly controlled or active disease, you should talk to your specialist. Autoimmune conditions are sometimes treated with immunosuppressants. Again, that may allow partial response to the COVID vaccines. And again, we need to talk about the side effects when we talk about the risks. So let's move on to that section. So what can I expect when I get the COVID-19 vaccine? You'll hear confusing statements like I might catch COVID from the vaccine, my arm will get sore, I heard you will get a fever, maybe I'll have to miss work, and the messenger RNA vaccine will change my DNA. So what are the adverse effects of the COVID vaccines? And you can see how I say on the bold line down below, again, as Kyla stated, these are not live vaccines, so you cannot get infected with the COVID from the actual vaccine. I want to talk about common and expected side effects. So sore arm, fever, chills, fatigue, headache, local redness to your injection site, muscle and joint ache. While these are all uncomfortable, they certainly are normal, common, mild, expected side effects that we wouldn't worry too much about. Some would argue, oh, I don't want to feel that way, but I would argue COVID infection could be much more serious than those symptoms. There are also other expected side effects, but these are more uncommon, and they may be a little bit more uncomfortable. So delayed onset extreme fatigue. So perhaps days or even a week or two after you get the vaccine, you may suddenly get really tired, maybe even get a high fever. There is something described in the media called COVID arm, where you get quite a bit of swelling in your arm, headache, muscle ache, maybe even get some hives that come on a few days after you get your vaccine. Again, it's uncomfortable, but they're very expected, and that set of symptoms are quite uncommon. In my third category, it's the rare and also very unexpected side effects. So I would put anaphylaxis in that category. We'll talk more about that because we all wear allergy hats as well. And then neurological symptoms we keep a close eye on. So thus far in Canada, as of February 12th data, I can tell you there's been over 1.5 million vaccines administered. There's even more now because we've really had a ramp up in the last 2 weeks, but this is data from February 12th, so at least 1.5 million. So far, there's no safety signals that have been identified, which is fantastic. The total adverse events following vaccination that have been reported to public health is 957, which is 0.078%, so very small amount. There's been 817 non-serious adverse events, so 0.067%, 140 serious adverse events, which is very, very small, 0.011%. And to qualify, serious adverse events would be those where there's a life-threatening potential, such as anaphylaxis, and this comprises mostly of anaphylaxis. Certainly death would be considered here. Anything where the patient needs to be hospitalized would be considered serious adverse events. There have been no deaths attributed to the COVID vaccine. 8 have been reported, 5 have been investigated, and it's felt not related to the vaccine. 3 are still under investigation. So I don't want you to think 3 deaths have been caused by the COVID vaccine. I think we're still working through there to see exactly what the relationship is. I don't expect you to look at all of this, but I want you to note that the most frequently reported adverse events really comprise of vaccine site reactions. So local swelling, redness, warmth, itching, there's some headache, nausea, anaphylaxis you can see, which is the most serious, is in the small amount. It's mostly vaccine site reactions that people are reporting. In the US, we've been able to gain a lot of data as to what exactly is the anaphylaxis rate. Certainly when the vaccines were first put out in the UK, there was a big scare because there were some allergic reactions reported. But I think we're a little bit reassured now that anaphylaxis is quite rare. So there's been over 60 million doses of both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines combined given in the US alone, let alone worldwide. Their anaphylaxis rates is about 4.7 cases per million for the Pfizer and 2.5 cases per million for the Moderna. Interestingly, about 90% are in females, and we're not exactly sure why that is. There's various theories behind that. Perhaps more frontline workers are female, nursing, long-term care workers, the elderly, females outlive males. Maybe that's why we're seeing it. So just more females are being vaccinated in general. 90% of the anaphylaxis occurs within the first 30 minutes. And in fact, it's within the first 15 minutes, most of these. So we're able to really catch them right away. About a third have a prior history of anaphylaxis. There's a wide range of history of allergies that are reported, so it's hard to say exactly what that relationship is. If we compare to other vaccines, you can see the rates of anaphylaxis: influenza 1.4 per million, pneumonia vaccines 2.5, shingles has a 9.6 million rate of anaphylaxis. So the COVID vaccine rates of anaphylaxis are not too much higher than other vaccines. So here's what the advice is. If you have allergies, and I'm going to say regular allergies like dust mite and animal and food and sting and drug allergy, there's really no concerns. Vaccinate as per usual, wait the 15 minutes. If you've had a severe allergic reaction to something injectable or a true history of anaphylaxis, we want to watch you a little bit longer, 30 minutes, so we can catch that prime time when anaphylaxis may happen. If someone's had a lot of anaphylaxis and maybe they're unexplained in their history, they should at least wait 30 minutes, and perhaps an assessment by an allergist would be useful beforehand as well. And the only contraindication and the only component potentially that seems to be causing allergy is something called polyethylene glycol. Polyethylene glycol allergy is extremely, extremely, extremely rare. I've only seen 2 cases in my 18 years of practice. So there's not going to be a lot of people walking around with PEG allergy to start with. Other types of reactions, so neurological reactions, suffice to say, none have been seen in trials. There were a few cases of Bell's palsy, but the rate did not seem to be increased over the background normal population. So we haven't really seen a whole lot of worrisome neurological effects so far. And mRNA vaccines will not change your DNA. You will still be the same amazing person. Nobody needs to worry about that. So what about immunoglobulin replacement? So it's going to take a while yet before protective antibodies are present in these blood product formulations. We certainly can't not rely on them at this point. We really need to see that herd immunity in the general population. So lots of people vaccinated, and of course, people who've actually had infection, making antibodies in the population and then donating their blood. It's still very, very unknown. We don't even know what a protective level would be for patients. So it's not something that's on anybody's radar that we can rely on that. In most patients with immunodeficiency, their dosing is going to be far lower than what we would see in immunomodulatory dosing used in other conditions. So in terms of, is the IVIG going to affect your vaccine response? It probably won't. But to be on the safe side, and I would say to ensure no confusion over any side effects, you just might want to try and schedule your subcutaneous immunoglobulin or your IVIG kind of separately, at least a couple of weeks from your vaccine, if possible. I'm going to tell you a quick little story, and I think those of my patients who are on here from Nova Scotia will recognize this picture. A big shout out to those working in public health. As much as I say, Kyla and I are doing lots of vaccine work and we're eating, breathing vaccine work, it really is the public health doctors that are carrying us through this pandemic. This is Dr. Robert Strang, who has done a phenomenal job in Nova Scotia. I will say he has a cleft lip, so a congenital malformation in his face. And this young boy also has a similar malformation, and decided Dr. Strang was his hero. He saw him on TV every single day at the beginning of the pandemic and was just inspired by him. And so Dr. Strang took the time to go visit this little boy. And this is a COVID stuffy. I have no idea where you get those, but apparently you can get a COVID stuffy if you want. So when will I get my vaccine? This is my daughter trying to pose as somebody coughing. So the rollout plan. So we've heard it's the largest mass vaccination program in Canada's history. Every province and territory are going to decide their best fit program for them. So I can't really say this is what it's going to be for you, but NACI will give the guidance. There's clearly differences in population, remoteness, age distribution, Indigenous communities that we need to take into consideration. And thus far, I think we would all agree that age is the single most identified risk factor for hospitalizations and death. And that's why it's taken priority. I envision that there will be online and phone registration. There will be consent forms that you will have to sign to say that you're aware you have immunodeficiency, you've spoken to your specialist, you're aware of the lack of information, but you still want to get your vaccine. There will be specialized public health vaccine centers, likely large centers, maybe even drive-through centers. Pharmacies and GP offices will likely be utilized, but it's going to take a while till we get to that stage. I don't expect us to go through this document, but it is from NACI, taking into all the considerations that they look at when they're coming up with their recommendations as to how they should prioritize people. This is right on the internet. If you just look up NACI and scroll through, you'll find this document. But you can see the different stages that they prioritize. So stage 1, elderly, frontline healthcare workers, because we don't want sick individuals going to hospital, getting COVID. We move on to Indigenous communities, residents and staff in other living scenarios besides long-term care, other first responders, and then stage 3, I think, is potentially where our immunodeficiency patients will fit. So individuals of all ages above 16 with underlying medical conditions where it's identified they're at high risk of severe illness. So unofficially, and Whitney helped us find this information today as well. So Kyla tells us that in BC, they really have advocated for the extremely vulnerable patients with immunodeficiency to be prioritized. In Manitoba, lucky them, their immunodeficiency patients can make appointments for vaccines now, I'm told. Into Ontario, they feel that high-risk chronic conditions will be done perhaps April through July, but we're not sure if that includes immunodeficiency patients. I would hope so. And I know in Nova Scotia, we're soon to discuss the high-risk patient groups. As you can imagine, there's been lots of different groups lobbying government. When's it our turn? They're likely not going to be ready to fully discuss this until seniors and long-term care are done. And certainly as more public clinics open up, they'll be wanting to have those discussions. Keep in mind, motherhood statement, even if you are vaccinated, you still need to practice public health measures, wear a mask, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and limiting your contacts. So here's my conclusions. Should you get your COVID vaccine? I'm going to say yes. In general, immunodeficiency patients, I would recommend that they should, and you can see it's supported by the different governing bodies. I would say though, if you have a complicated immune deficiency, please talk to your specialist. And if you don't have a specialist and you've been followed by your family doctor, I want you to know during COVID, we have the luxury of virtual medicine. So your family doctor should be able to get some type of virtual phone consult with a specialist within your province or near your area so that you don't have to travel or take risks to come into a clinic. So please really try to advocate for yourself, and I'm sure CIPO can help as well, put you in touch with the right people. What can you expect after the COVID-19 vaccine? So again, side effects are uncommon, mild, and manageable. Serious side effects are even very, very uncommon, and they've been treatable thus far. When will you get vaccinated, I should say? Stay tuned. Age is the determining factor right now, and then early stage 3, hopefully at the very latest. And that's it.
Yeah, that was terrific, and thank you for taking us through that. And as anticipated, and looking at the questions that were submitted, and there were several, we thought we would get through many of them in the presentations, and I think we have. And when we got the questions in, I tried to categorize them into questions related to efficacy, safety, prioritization, replacement therapy, and then others. And maybe what we can do if we go through some of these is start with efficacy. And I see that there are a couple of them asked, and these weren't pre-submitted, but it's a question that, Gina, perhaps I'll start with you, because you mentioned the timing, and we don't really know exactly the best timing when you're on IVIG to get one of the current vaccines or future vaccines. What would you suggest for sub-Q, given that it's given weekly? And there's a question from the chat. Would you have any suggested timing for that, or do you think it would matter?
So there's no evidence behind this for sure. It hasn't been studied. But my gut tells me it's probably not going to matter. You know, usually with subcutaneous immunoglobulin, it's lower doses more on a regular basis. I don't think it's going to affect the efficacy of the vaccine at all. Again, I think I would separate them by at least a couple of days, just so that when you get your vaccine, if you do get some mild side effects or any side effects at all, you won't be confused. Was it your subcutaneous immunoglobulin? Was it the vaccine? I think it just makes things cleaner if you try to separate it. So I think by a few days would be plenty. If you really held a weekly dose because you wanted to be absolutely sure. It's probably not the end of the world for most patients with immunodeficiency. There's some who are going to dose every 2 weeks. So that way, you know, maybe get your vaccine just before you're about to do your 2-week dose. So there's a longer time frame.
But most importantly, get the vaccine.
Get the vaccine.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And Kyla, maybe I can ask you, there's another question in the chat, and this relates to something you commented on. Why would you use a vaccine that's only 60 to 72% range of efficacy when there are vaccines available at 95%? Why would you choose a vaccine that would have a lower efficacy?
Right. So that's an excellent question. You know, I think to say that the bar was set from Health Canada to have vaccines that were 50% efficacious or better. So already with that bar being set, these vaccines are all exceeding. I think the mRNA vaccines came out of the gate with really great numbers, and it will be really useful to follow the real world data that's emerging now that the vaccines have been approved and are in use in many countries throughout the world. So in terms of like the vaccine efficacy and like choosing, you know, the provinces and territories will likely not have choice, and they will be administering vaccines as they get them. I would say that the population that is enrolled in these studies ranges in age, and there can be a variety of reasons, you know, across the age spectrum why efficacy might be a bit different. But it certainly does speak to the platforms of the vaccines that are developed. You know, if it were me, I would take any vaccine that was offered to me. And we are seeing really good data, even with single doses of vaccine schedules that were intended to be 2-dose schedules. And there are ongoing studies looking at efficacy of just that. So I think there's more to come. You know, for the ones that are currently approved, they're excellent, over 90%. Part of the other reason for using maybe a vaccine that's a little bit less efficacious compared to others is that sort of race to generate herd immunity. So if we can get a vaccine into as many Canadians as possible and bring our herd immunity up above 70%, that's considered to have a greater health impact for many Canadians than ensuring that the efficacy of the vaccine is super, super high. So that would be my answer there. I don't know, Gina, if you have anything else to add to that.
That sounds great. Yeah, no, nothing to add.
And maybe on that note, and sort of sticking with efficacy, and then we can move to perhaps address some of the questions that are being asked and that were submitted. What would be the role? So is there a role for looking at or assessing antibody levels in immunodeficiency patients to see if they've responded to immunization? And I'll just open that generally to either.
Yeah, I can take that one. So, I mean, it is possible to measure clinically antibody titers to SARS-CoV-2, but the problem is we don't know how long those titers will remain. Because this is a new virus in the setting of a pandemic, even if you have protective, and what is protective really is the other question. I think that's not quite known. So I would say that it would worry me maybe that someone was sort of going off the basis that they had protective titers at one point in time, but those could wane very easily. So in terms of using it as a decision point, like, do you get the vaccine or do you not? I think it's always more beneficial to get the vaccine. And there's even newer studies that are coming out looking at those who have had SARS-CoV-2 infections. You know, do they really need 2 doses of vaccine afterwards? Maybe 1 is sufficient. So that data is emerging as well in the next few weeks and months.
Can I just add as well, there are protocols being put together right now looking at and investigating response of patients with immunodeficiency. How do they respond to the vaccines? There are treaters all across the country. We're working very hard to make this a national research endeavor. So hopefully some of you patients on here tonight will be involved at studying what is your response to the vaccine when you finally get it. Very exciting.
Yes.
And Gina, you touched right on the point that one of the questions that was submitted was, are there any known studies we can enroll in to help compile data on PI patients and COVID vaccines? And you're absolutely right. We do hope those studies will go ahead. They're being submitted, and I believe all of us on the call will be involved in those, and many other sites. It'll be very important to understand this, so when vaccines are developed in the future, we'll know how immunodeficiency patients respond and what might need to be considered in their development in the future. One of the issues, again, and it's coming in the chat and moving a little bit away from efficacy, perhaps more to prioritization and herd immunity. I guess the question could be asked when we and Kyla or Gina, you went through the different stages, the 1, 2, and 3. Could an argument be made, and I'll open it to both of you, that if we do think that immunodeficiency patients might not respond well to immunization, should their family members and close contacts be put into that prioritization group a little bit higher because of that herd and local herd immunity potentially?
I mean, I think there's argument for that for sure. I guess we have to see how it's advocated at the provincial levels as to where they put patients, put the primary immunodeficiency patients in. So I would agree. There's definitely argument for advocating for that. We'll have to see how that works out.
Yeah, and just echoing your comments there, Gina, I think, you know, we've seen that with residents of long-term care homes, that sort of primary caregivers are being put ahead so that they can get immunized in order to protect their loved ones in the long-term care homes. It would be really nice to see a similar strategy. I think from the province and territories perspective, sometimes kind of coordinating that can be a little bit more challenging for patients who are not in one physical location, who are in the community. But I know that there's a number of advocacy groups who would who are currently lobbying their governments to do just that.
And I'll just follow up, Kyla, and because you're a pediatric clinical immunologist and allergist, there's a question that is there that I think will probably resonate to many and beyond. So in patients who have a primary immune deficiency, but they're at an age below the licensed age for a vaccine, how can that be addressed? What would be done to advocate for immunization in that patient population?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We know that children have been really sort of left to the sidelines during this pandemic for a number of reasons. But, you know, it's not uncommon for new vaccines when they come out to look only at healthy individuals initially, and then to expand the special populations thereafter once they've demonstrated safety and efficacy. And the most important piece there is the safety. So Moderna is currently enrolling children who are 12 years of age and up. And I believe Pfizer is also recruiting for children who are 6 years of age and up presently. So we're hopeful that in the next few months, by summer, we'll have some data in pediatrics that will perhaps open the doors for regulatory bodies to approve for at least older children, particularly school-age children who have been, you know, significantly sidelined because of the pandemic with school closures, et cetera.
And just looking at the time, and I do want to turn this back to Whitney for closure. I think we got through a lot of the themes, and I apologize if we can't get to everybody's questions. The questions are all very good and all very thoughtful and insightful. But I want to leave with one question that relates to a common theme that's come up. It's came up in prior in the prior webinars in the past. Just understanding, and you touched a little bit on when we may start to see anti-COVID spike antibodies in plasma supply, but understanding that difference between the plasma supply antibodies and what convalescent plasma is, and that difference. And I'll just open it up to either of you to comment.
Yeah, so I can take that one. So there is a study currently ongoing in Canada looking at the use of convalescent plasma in the treatment of individuals who have SARS-CoV-2 infections. Convalescent plasma is different than kind of what you might receive as passive antibody transfer through an immunoglobulin product, in that it's obtained from those who have recently been infected and recovered from COVID-19 infection. And this plasma that's collected is in various sort of aliquots where it's just concentrated antibodies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so that's what makes it different from an immunoglobulin product, which is sort of all-comer of types of antibodies. The convalescent plasma could be considered as like a concentrated version of COVID-19 antibodies.
Great, thank you. And I think what I'll do before I turn it back to Whitney is thank both Gina and Kyla. Very insightful presentations. Really, really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. Certainly fascinating to be talking about vaccines in such a short time frame, and thank you for that. What I'd like to do, Whitney, is turn it back to you for any closing remarks. Before I do, I just want to comment. There was one comment asking for that link to the study looking at immune response. It's a little too early for that. We're hoping it will get funded at some point, but as soon as it is out and available, we'll make sure we can roll that out, and perhaps CIPO might be able to disseminate that information as well. But Whitney, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. Wonderful moderation. Thank you, Stephen Betschel, for that. Wonderful co-chair of our Medical Science Advisory Committee. Thank you so much to Gina Lacuesta and Kyla Hildebrand, who are both new medical directors with CIPO. Welcome aboard. And what a wonderful webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us. We will be posting the webinar on CIPO's website and YouTube channel tomorrow. So look out for that. And thank you everyone for joining us. You can find it on our Facebook website tomorrow. And the questions that didn't get answered, I will ask both Dr. Lacuesta and Dr. Hildebrand, if they wouldn't mind, maybe we can follow up with them on those questions.
Sounds great. Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye.